one of the big talking points heading into 2024 is who's going to be in the second Red Bull seat. Will it be Perez? Will it be Ricardo? Or will it be somebody else? Lots of rumors about Norris going there, but now we know Norris has a new contract with McLaren, so it's not going to be him. But it's certainly going to be interesting to see who it is. Perez is really going to have to take a step in the right direction if he has any chance of retaining his seat. Maybe it's been sealed already, his fate, but we shall see. I guess it depends on how Ricardo performs and if there's anybody else on the market. But since that is going to be such a big talking point throughout the season, I wanted to talk a little bit about how Perez's 3 seasons with Red Bull have been so far. Have they really been as bad as what it felt this year, or has it been a little better than maybe sometimes we give him credit for? Let's take a look and compare his season with the deep dive of Gasly's and Albon's seasons against Verstappen as well. 2019 is when this whole fiasco of the second seat at Red Bull really started. After Ricardo's departure, they've been struggling to find a proper second driver to pair with Max Verstappen, somebody who can not challenge him too much, but still be able to help him along and really push the team forward and not be too far behind. 2019 was quite the tumultuous season for the second seat at Red Bull, since it had both Albon and Gasly having different stints at the team for that year. So let's take a look at Verstappen compared to Gasly and Albon in 2019. So obviously this was still in the Mercedes domination, so there wasn't quite the same numbers that Verstappen was putting out as he is now, but he still had a very respectable season, having picked up 3 wins, 1 pole position, 278 points, and a really good average finishing position of 3.53. So obviously a really solid season from him, but little did we know it was just the beginning of what was to come. So obviously we know how quick Verstappen is and what he's capable of, especially now, but how were his teammates looking at the time, Gasly and Albon? So Gasly started off the first half of the season, and on average, Gasly was 0.481 slower than Verstappen. So a pretty substantial gap there. Obviously, you probably want to be within a couple tenths of your teammates, or at least that's what Red Bull would be looking for the second driver. But close to half a second is quite the large gap. But in that year, Gasly had 0 wins, 0 pole positions, which I'm not too surprised in given the Mercedes domination was still occurring, and that was Gasly's first year and only year at Red Bull. He wound up with 95 points to finish off the year, and his average finishing position was 7.73 just for the races that he was at Red Bull. I didn't include the second half of the season when he was at Toro Rosso, just because that was a bit less relevant. The car was less competitive, so it's kind of pointless comparing it to Verstappen there. And lastly, Gasly had 34.2% of Verstappen's points. Once again, a little asterisk there, just because that was Gasly wasn't in the Red Bull for the entire season. So tough to compare that to some of the other things that we'll take a look at. Yeah, not the best season from Gasly. I think they expected a lot more from him out the get-go, and after Hungary, they decided to make a switch. So Albon came in after the summer break, and he also had 0 wins, 0 poles. Once again, not a big surprise. And he was marginally quicker than Gasly. He was 0.433 slower than Verstappen on average. He actually wound up with less points, but it was less races in the second half of the season at 92 points. And he had a much better, maybe not much better, but he did have a better average finishing position at 6.22. So a good place and a half better than Gasly. So that led him to having a stronger second half of the season than maybe Gasly did, at least in terms of the races. And then Albon had 33.1% of Verstappen's points. Once again, asterisk besides that, because first half of the season he was at Toro Rosso, and then the second half he was in Red Bull, so can't expect him to score quite as many points as Verstappen, since Verstappen was in the better machinery. Now looking at 2020, obviously quite the strange year because of the world circumstances at the time, but in Formula One with the Red Bull team, they had some consistency going from the second half of 2019 into the full year of 2020, with Albon being Verstappen's teammate for the entire year. and it really gave a full year opportunity to Albon to see if he deserved a spot at the team. However, I do think it was a challenging year for all of the drivers, but in particular Albon, just because he wasn't really able to bet himself in at the team. I think because of the pandemic, there was quite the delay to the season, and maybe that had a negative impact on his season. Nonetheless, looking at Verstappen's year, a decent year once again. There were a few less races as compared to 2019, but this was a particularly dominant year for Mercedes. So Verstappen walked away with 2 wins, 1 pole position, 214 points, and a really strong average finishing position of 2.42. So even though Albon had a full year in the Red Bull as opposed to a half year in 2019, his season actually took a turn for the worse compared to his showing in 2019. He was on average 0.482 slower than Verstappen as compared to the 0.433 in the previous year. He had 0 wins, 0 pole positions, and he scored 105 points, which was, for having a full season, not much more than the 92 that he scored in the half season the year prior. So definitely a challenging year for him. On average, he finished 7.75, and he scored 49.1% of Verstappen's points. So, more points a little bit, and a more challenging year for Red Bull overall because of the Mercedes domination. But Albon was slower than Verstappen compared to the year prior, and he had a lower average finishing position. So a challenging year for Albon, and because of that, they decided to make a change and bring in Sergio Perez in 2021. So 2021 was obviously a breakthrough year for Verstappen. I think everybody knew how good he was before, but this was the first opportunity for him to really go toe-to-toe against one of the greats. And by the end of the year, he wound up with 10 wins, 8 pole positions, 395.5 points, and an average finishing position of 1.84. Very, very strong season on his part. Perez, on the other hand, had not quite the strongest season. However, it was a lot to expect him to be on top of Verstappen's pace with his first year there, especially after all the tumultuousness going on in that team of the prior years with the different driver change-up. But Perez ended up being slower in qualifying on average than Albon and Gasly. He was 0.557 slower. He wound up with just 1 win and 0 pole positions, and he wound up with 190 points. Only had an average finishing position of 6.6, and he wound up with 48% of Verstappen's points. So an okay showing from Perez for his first season, but not the best, and I think Red Bull would have preferred that to be a little stronger. Had he been stronger, and had Bottas been stronger on the Mercedes side, it could have been a very different season in 2021. 2022 brought the beginning of the dominance of Red Bull and Max Verstappen, even though it looked like a very fun year for the first half of the year with Ferrari having the faster car. They wound up definitely not the fastest car by the end of the year, and Red Bull really started to dig its heels in and assert its dominance by the end of the year. And because of that, Verstappen wound up with 15 wins, only 2 pole positions, since the Ferrari was much quicker on qualifying day, 467 points, and an average finish of 2.95. So actually worse than the previous year, but he had a very strong season with a ton of wins. Now Perez, on the other hand, he also improved in 2022. He was showing some good signs. He was still quite behind Verstappen in terms of average qualifying. He wound up 0.43 slower than Verstappen over the course of the year in qualifying, but he did make progress by over a tenth of a second. He wound up with 2 wins, 1 pole position. Of course, at the beginning of the year, like with 2023, they were talking about a potential Perez title fight, but obviously that didn't quite come to fruition. He wound up with 315 points and a very strong average finishing position of 4.1. And lastly, he wound up with 67.5% of Verstappen's points, which was the best for any Red Bull driver since Daniel Ricciardo. So a very strong second season for Perez, and he was looking really promising, making good progress, and looking like he might be a long-term fit for Red Bull. Coming to 2023, things took a turn for the better and for the worse for Verstappen and Perez respectively. Obviously, Verstappen had the most dominant season in Formula One, 19 wins, 13 pole positions, 575 points, and an average finishing position of 1.27, which is absolutely insane. Perez, on the other hand, even with the most dominant car of all time in his hands, he had a very poor season, even compared to his first and second years at Red Bull. He wound up on average 0.638 slower than Verstappen in qualifying. He wound up with 2 wins, 2 pole positions, only 285 points, so he got less points in 23 compared to 22. Average finishing position at 3.5, which was an improvement. And he had 49.6% of Verstappen's points. So quite the downward trend for Perez in 2023, even with the best car. Quite the shocking season from him, actually. He missed 8 Q3 sessions. That run of missing Q3 was pretty insane, to say the least. And overall, it was just not a very strong season for Perez. So let's take a look at Perez, Albon, and Gasly and compare them directly. Now, on average, over the course of his 3 seasons, Perez was 0.542 slower. He averaged 55% of Verstappen's points. He averaged 263.3 points and an average finishing position of 4.73. Now, Albon, on the other hand, he averaged 0.458 slower than Verstappen throughout his year and a half. Got 41.1% of the points, averaging only 98.5% or 98.5 points over the course of his season and a half, which both of those have asterisks. Those have the half seasons included, and he only had an averaging finishing position of 6.99. I know part of it is challenging to compare because Perez has been in a pretty dominant car for 2 of the 3 seasons, but even then, some of the stats are not in Perez's favor, even though he had a more dominant car. Gasly, for his half season, he was 0.481 slower than Verstappen, scored 34.2% of the points, and that equaled 95 points, and his average finishing position was 7.73. So, taking a look at all of those drivers compared, Perez was actually slower on average in qualifying compared to Albon and Gasly. Perez was on average 0.084 of a second slower than Albon and 0.061 of a second slower than Gasly over the course of all of their times at Red Bull. So, putting it all together, how has Perez's 3 seasons with Red Bull really looked compared to Gasly and Albon? Is he really worthy of the 3 seasons with Red Bull, or should have Albon and Gasly been given more opportunity to show what they could do in the Red Bull? So typically, Perez was actually slower in qualifying compared to Gasly and Albon. However, he was much stronger in the races. He had higher finishing positions in all of the seasons, and just overall looked a lot more comfortable and strong in the races. He often struggled to get a hold of the 3 Red Bull cars that he's driven in qualifying, but in terms of the race, he's done a pretty decent job, having some good comeback drives, and generally Perez is quite good in the races. He has good tire management, and I think that's definitely a contributing factor to why he's been given so many opportunities compared to Albon and Gasly. Gasly is particularly challenging to figure out how he would have done with a full season under his belt, to really know if he would have done better than Perez or Albon, since he only had the half season. But in the case of Albon and Perez, we've gotten opportunities to really see them have more of an opportunity to showcase what they can. And Albon had the year and a half, and Perez is obviously at 3 years and going on his 4th year with Red Bull. And Albon's 2nd year, he wasn't able to show enough to justify them keeping him on in the eyes of Red Bull. But Perez, on the other hand, he showed some really strong progress going from 2021 to 2022. He had a much stronger season in 2022, more wins, more poles, more points, better averaging finishing positions, and just a better season overall. He was in talks for title contention at the beginning of the year and just had a much stronger season overall in his 2nd year. So I certainly don't blame Red Bull for keeping him on for a 3rd year. He looked like a really good shout to maintain that 2nd seat. However, 2023 definitely doesn't help Perez's case for why he should have been kept on at Red Bull longer than Albon or Gasly, since 2023 was by far his worst season at Red Bull. He missed Q3 8 times. He was on average in qualifying much slower than Verstappen compared to the other 2 seasons, and just had a very, very poor season overall. Even though he started off the season very strong, he struggled throughout the year to keep anywhere near Verstappen and was not able to get any more wins or poles, and even struggled to get podiums after Miami. After Miami, he was really deflated, and that was truly the end of his title campaign. Another surprising fact that I had found out was how often Perez missed Q3 as compared to Albon and Gasly. Even across a longer season, Perez missed significantly, or even across shorter seasons, Albon and Gasly both missed Q3 less frequently than Perez did. Just in 2023 alone, he missed it 8 times, and in 2021 and 2022, it was a bit more in line, missing Q3 8 times with Albon and Gasly's years. So yeah, interestingly enough, he has not performed super well in qualifying compared to Albon and Gasly, but once again, like I was mentioning, the races were definitely Perez's stronger side of things. I think a big mark against Albon deserving another year at Red Bull is the fact that in his second year at Red Bull, given a full season, even though it was a COVID season, it was still more races than his 2019 campaign. He actually managed to only score 13 more points throughout the entire year in 2020 compared to 2019. That's really not good, being in the Red Bull car compared to the Toro Rosso, and for him to only score that many more points than the previous year, I think that shows how much he really struggled in the races in particular. Even though he qualified decently well compared to like what Perez has been doing, his racecraft was certainly a lot worse. If we're doing Formula 1 math, since Perez has generally done better in the races than Albon, and you could argue that Perez has done a better job than Albon's time at Red Bull, then Perez must be better than Gasly, because Albon was marginally quicker and did marginally better than Gasly's time at Red Bull. However, we do have to have an asterisk next to that, since Gasly did have such a short time, having only half a season in the Red Bull. Who knows what would have happened if he would have had another full year like Albon, but all we have is what we have, and in that time, Albon was marginally quicker than Gasly. So with a lot of these stats really going against Perez, comparing him to Albon and Gasly, how did Perez end up with 3 going on 4 seasons at Red Bull, while Gasly only got half a season and Albon only got 1.5 seasons? I think it's largely because Perez had shown the most progress and improvement. In addition, he was much stronger in the races. Like I had mentioned, going from 2021 to 2022, Perez made a big step in his performances. Not only was he quicker on average in qualifying, but he finished higher on average and had a much stronger season overall. He was much better in the races than Albon or Gasly, and just overall looked to be progressing a lot more and looked like he might be able to hold on to that second seat. Now, looking at 2023, I think that definitely goes against him, since he went even worse than his 2021 year. But yeah, I think that's a contributing factor, since Gasly, well, he didn't have much time to really bet himself in and see what he can do, but Albon didn't show as much improvement going into his second year. He had a worse second full year at Red Bull compared to his half season at Red Bull in 2019, and I think that definitely went against him. Gasly, we now know that maybe he didn't have the best relationship with the Red Bull team while he was there. There's been rumors about him maybe playing the blame game a little bit and pointing fingers at other people. So I think part of the main reason he didn't get an opportunity for another year was maybe because of his relationship with the team. But we don't really know, being on the outside. That just seems to be the case from what I've heard. So overall, I think it was right to bring Perez in. I think generally he was an improvement in 2021 and 2022, and I don't blame them for signing him on for 2023, since he was making good progress in 2022. However, looking back after 2023 is finished up, I think it's definitely a harder case to bet for Perez because of how poor his season has been. I think maybe Gasly deserved a little more time, and Albon too, now that we know how good he is in that Williams. But who knows, maybe Albon never would have developed into the driver that he is now had he not been dropped by Red Bull and had that year on the sidelines. So overall, probably was the best move to bring in Perez, but I think now, after 2023's year for Perez, I think it is probably time to start looking at some other drivers, especially if he has another poor year this year. I think his fate might be sealed already if he has a poor season. But who knows? Maybe he'll just get his head down, focus up, and have a strong year and make the debate for the second seat at Red Bull a more challenging debate, and maybe he'll have another year there. Who knows? Anyways, it was fun to do a deep dive of Perez versus Gasly and Albon versus Verstappen to see who really deserves that second Red Bull seat. Let me know what you guys think. Follow me on social medias, like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.